I want to talk about the Aztec Sunstone. This is a really amazing sculpture that survived the Spanish conquest, and you can see this object on display now in Mexico City. I found out about the Sunstone while doing research on the sun, and this lecture I'm going to give you, or this talk, will be of interest to you if you want to know more about the history of Mexico and the Aztecs, if you want to learn more about occultism, secret knowledge, or if you're just curious, truth seeker, this video is for you. So let's jump right in. On the left is a picture of the Sunstone, and you can see that there are some people in front of it there. It's a very large object, and it's very complex. It has lots of imagery and graphics in it. And it's somewhat of a mystery what's going on because it's so complex. In this video, though, I'm going to break it down and explain to you in a very straightforward and simple way what the Sunstone appears to represent. On the right is a picture of Montezuma II, and the Sunstone was created during his reign in the 1500s. This is right before the Spanish came and destroyed the Aztec Empire. And when the Spanish came and started destroying the empire, some people had the wisdom or the foresight to bury this object underground. So they buried the Sunstone. So it was hidden for hundreds of years, and it was rediscovered in the late 1700s, and it's been preserved, and now it's on display in Mexico City, and you can see it. All right, if you become curious about the Aztec Sunstone and you start going on the internet looking for information about it, you'll find either like very vague information, or you'll find sort of outrageous claims like this one here, like how and when will the world end according to the Aztec Sunstone. Because as I'm going to show you in this video, when you look at the imagery on this stone, it says the exact opposite. It shows you how the world began. It does not say anything about how the world will end. So it's kind of ironic. So don't believe everything you read on the internet. Here's another one that came out recently in a famous American newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. They're like an ancient enigma carved in stone, that it has visions of terror and violence, but its true meaning and purpose remain a mystery. I thought this is interesting because I wrote a chapter in my book explaining what I think this means, and it's very clear, and hopefully you'll be convinced at the end of this talk. And I emailed this author and said, hey, it's not really that much of a mystery. It's pretty easily understood what is going on in the Sunstone. And the person wrote back and said, well, you're not credentialed, so therefore you can't know the truth. And that's a big problem in the modern world. People in these fields, they get very defensive of what they're doing, and they're not open to any outsiders coming in and making interesting observations or possibly shedding light on what they do. So, luckily, I guess I'm part of a new trend of people who are not technically anthropologists or archaeologists, but I don't know. I think I have some good insights on this thing, and hopefully you will too. All right, now there are some good scholars out there who've done some good work on the Sunstone. There are two in particular. One is this guy, David Stewart, and he has a very important observation about the central disk of the Sunstone. And then there was another scholar in the 1930s who also had a really good explanation of what is going on with the so-called fire snakes that are surrounding the Sunstone. Other than that, I read dozens of scholarly articles about the Sunstone. I also read like at least 6 books about it. And honestly, I felt like they did not understand what was going on. Either the analysis was too detailed to the point where it doesn't make sense, or it was too abstract and maybe it makes sense mathematically, but there's no grounding, no connection to the natural world or to Aztec history. So what I'm going to present you today, it's not really found in any book except for the one I published on the esoteric sun. And maybe archaeologists in the future will read my book and then not tell anyone, and then they'll come up with their own similar conclusion 10 or 20 years from now. Okay, we'll see. All right, so what does the Aztec Sunstone show you? Well, it definitely does not show you the ending of our current world. In fact, it shows you the opposite. It shows you the birth of our current era of time that the Aztecs called the fifth sun. And what the Aztec Sunstone shows you is that the fifth sun was born from or created from a perfect alignment of all the cosmic patterns, particularly the sun and the moon and Venus. So they were very interested in what was going on with the sun, the moon, and Venus, and they stressed throughout the sunstone that everything was in a perfect harmony and a perfect alignment, and they showed that using simple mathematical ratios. It also shows that Montezuma II was the earthly embodiment or representation of the gods here on earth, and that he was supported by the gods, and also that the Aztec Empire of Montezuma II was the rightful heir and successor of the four previous eras of Aztec history. So if you want to summarize what the Sunstone actually shows you, this is it. And now I'm going to go through and break it down step by step and explain how it came to these conclusions. So there's a picture of the Sunstone again. And like I said, when you look at it, it's very complex. So it's hard to understand at first. You therefore need to break it down and look at it in sections, and then it becomes much easier to understand. And the first, here is an outline. I just want to go through this. So we have here the central disk of the Sunstone right here, and this has a face. So this is the God King. It's right here in the center. Then the God King is surrounded by the four previous eras of Aztec history. And that implies that the current God / king is emerging from the past, from history, but that it's a continuous lineage, that he's the rightful heir. All right, then the next ring out is the ritual calendar. And this is the same calendar that the Mayans used. So this is a very, very ancient calendar in Mesoamerica. And the Aztecs used this to determine important things like what was the energy of the day that a person was born, when certain rituals should occur, etc. The next set of rings that go around are more complex, and they show us the interrelationship of the cycles of the sun or the solar year, the moon phases, and the cycles of Venus. Then finally, on the outside, we have a set of rings that surround the whole thing, and they represent a war club of the sun god. They also are a bridge that helps the math to work. And it's also a connection to the natural world that I'm going to show you about. So that's what's going on at a high level, and now we're going to go into the details of each section to illustrate why I say it represents what it represents. So if you take the central face and you isolate it, you see that it creates the outline of an eagle. And the eagle to the Aztecs was related to the sun. And this is definitely a solar disk in the middle. So the sun god and Montezuma II are represented by the solar disk. Then these are the talons of the eagle. This is the beak of the eagle, and this is the tail of the eagle. So the sun rises in the morning. That's the eagle soaring to the heights. Then at 12 noon, the sun reaches its highest point. That's the eagle ascending. Then the eagle would start to descend as the sun sets. Then by midnight, the sun is completely gone, and then the cycle starts over again. And notice that the region of the tail that is in the point of time when the sun is completely gone, midnight, is represented by stars. This is Venus and its pattern, the cycle of Venus that occurs. Whereas here in the daytime, at the transition points where the sun is at its weakest, the god is holding a pair of hearts, one in each hand. The heart was said by the Aztecs to have solar energy. They called it tonal. And you can see at sunrise and sunset, the god's grasp on the solar energy. The god is grasping it and holding it because it's tenuous. It's trying to keep that solar energy there. But by 12 noon, we have this pyramid shape coming up. So this is like a solar pyramid going up to the heavens. And this is also the royal crown. So this is the sun at its highest point. And it's in Hinduism, it's like the Shiva Lingam. The sun is rising up and it reaches its highest point. And this is sort of a similar concept of ascension. Now, the sun disk itself has a lot of solar references, and I'm just going to point those out. So here, this triangle would represent sunrise. This would represent 12 noon. This would represent sunset. This would represent 12 midnight. Now, you could also look at this in terms of the solar year. So I'm going to just erase this. So on the solar year, this would be the spring equinox. This would be the summer equinox. This would be the fall. This is the summer solstice, sorry. This would be the fall equinox. This would be the winter solstice. So we'd have equinox, solstice, equinox, solstice. And we'd also have the cross quarter days indicated here. So this is definitely solar in its reference. You could also view it as the cardinal directions. So, this would be the east, this would be the south, this would be the west, and this would be the north, because yes, the Aztecs are in the northern hemisphere. And so there's a lot of solar references going on here, in addition to the fact that this is the sun god and this is an eagle. So lots and lots of solar references. Now, this is where that paper by Stewart, or these observations by this person named Stewart, are very, very important, because what he pointed out was that these hieroglyphs here, this one is the symbol for Montezuma II, and this one is for a god, and it's a piece of flint. This is one of the gods, not this central god, but this is another supporting solar god. And so he's saying, and this solar god was associated with Montezuma. So he's saying here that by putting these glyphs here, the artists were indicating that this face represents the god, but it also represents the king, and it represents another supporting solar god. So they had a very complex cosmology system with many gods, but they're saying here that this this is the god and the king. And it's almost like literally like signing his name here to indicate this. Now, another interesting thing from an occult perspective, I don't know if the Aztecs were aware of this or not, but these are the 4 previous eras of Aztec history that surround the central face. And these 4 previous eras were all destroyed by disasters. So this era was destroyed by wind. This was destroyed by monsters. This one was destroyed by water. This one was destroyed by fire coming from the sky. All right, now from an occult perspective, these would be the 4 classical elements: air, earth, water, and fire. That's interesting. I don't know if they were aware of that, but it is interesting to note. Now, the next ring around here represents the ritual calendar. The Mayans use this same ritual calendar, and these each day of the ritual calendar is said to represent a particular type of energy, and you get unique combinations of the ritual calendar with the solar calendar. So it's a shorter calendar than the solar calendar. It's fewer days, but it was very important for determining rituals, for determining what someone's life would be like based on the day they're born, and other, abstract esoteric uses. Now, on the sunstone itself, this is not meant to be a literal calendar. They're not saying you somehow calculate time using the sunstone. No. They're just showing that this calendar is embodied in their system. And they're just acknowledging this calendar here. It's just an acknowledgement of the existence of this, because they're trying to establish the authority of this new era in Aztec history, the fifth sun. And they want to show that it is emerging from the past. And as I said, this is a very ancient calendar that predates the Aztecs. So they're showing that in the context of time, the new era of Aztec history is being born. And it's been supported by the previous eras, and it's in alignment with the ritual calendar. Now, in this outer ring, we have the solar year, or the regular calendar. We think of the 365-day calendar, but it's combined with cycles of the moon and cycles of Venus. And I'm going to illustrate this. And it's pretty clear that the Aztecs, at least the Aztec priests or the artists who created this, were very interested in mathematical ratios and playing little games with the math, like how, the moon cycles could relate to the Venus cycles, that could relate to the Aztec century, and how they all relate to each other and how they relate to things in nature. So that's what we're going to look at next. It's very mathematical, but it's not complex math. It's ratios, but it took a lot of thought to figure out this relationship. And I think that they really stress the math, just kind of going back to that for a second. They really stress this math because, it's not wanting to go back. They really stressed it because the math sort of established authority. It's like when we look for evidence of things in nature, we want to see empirical evidence. Well, for them, this was empirical evidence that their priests and their cosmological view was true, because it was supported by the math observed in nature. Okay, so what is some of this math? So every 52 years, their 260-day ritual calendar, and interesting, this calendar, I think, if I remember correctly, it's related to the period of gestation of a woman who's pregnant. All right, so every 52 years, their ritual calendar and their 365-day solar calendar return back to the same starting point, because these calendars are different lengths. So they start off at the same point, but then they become asynchronous very quickly. But after 52 years, they return back to that same starting point. And they thought this was a very inauspicious time, because they were afraid that the world could end at this time because there was instability. It was a transition point. And whenever there's transition, there's uncertainty. So they would do something called the New Fire ceremony every 52 years to help ensure the survival of the world. And this would involve the sacrifice of humans to get the hearts, sacrifice of warriors and other people who they would, keep for this purpose. And then also they would put out all the fires, and then they would relight the fires from a central fire that was created in a person's heart. So pretty grisly, but that was their religious practice. Now the sunstone is important because it shows the completion of 2 of these 52-year cycles. So this was not just a regular end of a 52-year. This is a very important in their view because it's 2 of these 52-year cycles coming to an end. Now how do we know that? Well, you just count. So there are little shapes. They're almost like upside down U's, and there are 52 of these on each side of the sunstone. That indicates that this is a span of 52 years on this side. You can see these things right here. And then there are 52 years on this side. So it's the completion of 2 of these conjoining of the calendars. So very, very important time. And at the end of these 2 52-year periods, the new era, or 13 reed, or the 5th sun, was born. Now, they show this in different ways, and they wanted to relate this to the number 13 because the number 13 is related to the cycles of the moon, and it's also related to cycles of Venus. And as I said before, they were trying to get evidence. They were like scientists almost. They were looking in nature for truth. They were trying to find evidence in nature that would support their cosmological beliefs. So they found that the number 13 was very important because 13 relates, you can divide 52 by 13 and you get 4. So what they're showing here on this thing, on the outer ring, they have 13 divisions. And then there are 4 of these house-like structures. So what they're saying here is that if you are to take 4, and if you were to take 13 and multiply it by 4, you get 52. So 13 times 4 equals the 52. And they called these year bearers. There were 4 year bearers. So each one of these represented a period of 13 years, and then there were 4 of them. So they were getting this ratio of the 13. And then they would multiply by 4 to get the 52. Okay, now cycles of the moon. I talked about the moon. Let's look at the moon here. So the moon, in one Earth year, there are 13 moon orbits. So they showed this over and over again in different ways. So here on the top, you have 1, and then there are 13 dots in here. So the symbol for the 5th sun is 13 reed. So they were saying, look, this 13 reed, there's 13. So this is an incredibly auspicious thing. Our 2 52-year periods end. In the calendar, 13 reed is the symbol that came up. 13 relates to the moon, and it also relates to Venus. So this is an incredibly auspicious time for a new era of history to be formed. And that's what this is showing here. They show this in many ways. So between here and here, there's like 1 gap, but there are 13 of these little markers here. And then the moon is here. They're showing this is the moon, so they're indicating that these 13 are related to this moon symbol. And they show this again in a different way here. So in 8 Earth years, there's 104 moon orbits. So they have 8 of these marks here on the sunstone, right? There are 8 of these marks that go around if you count them. And then you multiply 8 by 13 and you get 104. And there are 104 of these little marks. And that's because there's 52 years on each side. So it's 104. So see, they were really interested in showing that the math corresponded. That all of the math was in perfect alignment. And that their current era was a reflection of this cosmological synchronous nature of time. All right, now Venus. How do they get the Venus cycles in there? This one is interesting too. So once again, in 8 Earth years, there are 13 Venus orbits. So that's kind of interesting, in the Venus. So here it is. And what's going on here is that when Venus orbits the Earth, over the period of 8 years, it creates a pentagram. And that's what this diagram is showing right here. It's calling what's called the pentagram of Venus. And if you observe the night sky over the course of 8 years, you will see that the planet Venus creates this pentagram pattern. And the Aztecs were astute astronomers. They were looking at the night sky all the time, so they were highly aware of this. Other cultures that were interested in the planet Venus were also aware of this, like the Mesopotamians and Babylonians, etc. So we have 8, we have 13, we have the pentagram. So where does this show up? Well, they show this over and over again. So Venus orbits the sun 13 times in 8 Earth years. So they show this. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little flames. And then there are 13 of these little dots. They show it again here. Now, they show the cycle of Venus all over the place. So wherever you see 5 dots, that means it's a complete Venus cycle. So from this Venus cycle here, where the 5 dots are, to this Venus cycle here, there are 8 of these little hash marks. So, it takes 8 years to complete a Venus cycle. So the Venus cycle is completed, 8 years goes by, you get the completion of another Venus cycle. And they show this over and over again on the sunstone. Here it is again, just in case you didn't get it the first time. Here are little Venus cycles. So they're saying in 8 years, you get the completion. So in 8 years, so in this case, the year is being represented by the little square with the Venus cycle in it, you get one complete Venus cycle. So there it is at its completion. So it starts here, and then it ends here. So they just keep showing the same thing over and over again. They show the year, the solar year, they show the cycles of the moon, they show the cycles of Venus, and they thought it was cool, or they thought it was evidence for truth, because that's probably a more accurate statement. They thought it was evidence of objectivity and truth because there was a mathematical pattern in nature that reflected their cosmology. And they took this as evidence that it was truth and supported by the gods. All right, so I mentioned these so-called fire snakes on the outside. They have 13 segments. There's one on each side of the sunstone. Now, this is very interesting. I'm going to just show you the math again, even though we saw this before. I'm just going to repeat it a little bit here. So what are these things? Well, first of all, these are weapons of this solar god. I cannot pronounce this name correctly, so I'm not even going to try. But the hieroglyph is here. So Stewart, in the anthropologist, wrote that paper. He said this hieroglyph represents this god, and these are the weapons of the god right here. There's one on each side, and you can see in this illustration, this is the weapon. And these are referred to as sun snakes. Now, this god was a sun god, but is a very belligerent god. He's god of human sacrifice, god of war. Tonatiuh, the central god, was also a pretty bloodthirsty god. So they had a lot of bloodlust going on here with the gods. They needed a lot of blood to keep the sun going and to keep the gods happy. Now, here are the divisions. There are 13 segments on this thing. And as I said before, this is really important because when you multiply 13 by 4, you get the magic number of 52, which represents the completion of the 2 calendars coming back together. Now, people have referred to these things as fire snakes. And that is actually incorrect. They are not snakes at all. And it's very surprising to me because there was an anthropologist, I believe, from Harvard in the 1930s who wrote a paper about this. And he was the first person to figure out what they really are. They are actually caterpillars. They are not snakes. They're insects. And specifically, I figured out that they're the caterpillar of a moth called Citheronia azteca that lives in the region where the Aztecs lived. And this moth the caterpillar of this moth looks pretty much identical to a fire snake. And I know this because I used to study insects for a living. I have a PhD and research PhD in the study of insects. So how do we know this is a moth? Well, first of all caterpillars have a tiny head called the head capsule. And this head capsule here is visible on the so-called fire snake. So there's a fold of skin with horns above it. And there's the horns. And then the head capsule is here, and there's a little face, and there's the head capsule right there with the little face. Now, there's a little tiny arm up front, and all caterpillars have little tiny arms on the front. There are these spiky things on the back of the caterpillar, and you can see them here on the back of the caterpillar. Caterpillars' bodies are divided into 13 segments. The fire snakes are divided into 13 segments. caterpillars have a foot on the back called the proleg. It's like it grasps the plant. And they clearly have this structure here on the fire snake. The caterpillars also have a spine on their back, on the tail, and the fire snake has this spine as well. So Darlington in 1931 said, hey, these things are caterpillars. He's absolutely correct. And when I started researching it, I realized that it's actually a specific kind of caterpillar that's found in this region. And this is the caterpillar here. It's called Citheronia azteca. It's a very large caterpillar. They grow to be almost like the size of a hot dog. And the moth is colored like the sun. It's bright orange and red. So it's a very spectacular moth. So what is the sunstone showing us? Well, the 13 reed, these are the eggs of the caterpillar. Then the fire snakes are the body of the caterpillar. And then the 4 eras of Aztec history with the sun god in the middle. This is the moth that the caterpillar turns into. So, and this symbol, this glyph, means movement. And moths move, they fly. So what they're showing here is that the new era was born from the previous era. So the moth lays the eggs. And where did the moth come from? Well, the moth came from these caterpillars. So the caterpillars, whoops, let me get the pen going. The caterpillars give rise to the moth. And then, and it's going to be a male and a female caterpillar. So they're going to mate. And then, each one is going to turn into a moth. They're going to mate. Then the female moth, the 4 previous eras of Aztec history, give birth to 13 reed, or the eggs, which represents the new Aztec era. So in their minds, they must have been noticing that, hey, Venus cycle 13, full moon cycle 13, our calendars aligned every 52 years, divided by 4, you get 13. Hey, this insect has 13 body segments. So I'm convinced that they were aware of this, and they saw this, and they thought, this is proof that we're correct, that our cosmology is correct, because look at nature. Nature is showing us this pattern over and over again, all the way from a caterpillar up to the planet Venus and the moon and the sun. So I think that's what's going on here, and it's very important to realize that these are not snakes, they're caterpillars, and it's a caterpillar from their environment. So the moth, the life cycle of the moth reflects the calendrical time, the seasons, the cosmic cycles of the sun and moon, Venus, and also Aztec history. The current era is born from the previous eras. And so I think this is a really interesting perspective, and it gives us a glimpse into the mind of these artists, and maybe the Aztecs in general, at least their priest class, about how they viewed the world and nature and the cosmos. All right, there's some other interesting stuff I want to cover really quick. So there is definitely a birth and a death axis here. So on the top, this is the birth axis, and this is the death axis. And I'm going to explain how we know that. But just to briefly summarize, in my book, The Esoteric Sun, I talk about this. When the sun rises in the morning, it takes time for it to develop its influence. It doesn't just immediately influence the world fully. It takes time. And this is analogous to a period of gestation during pregnancy. So the sun is conceived in the morning, but then at 12 noon, the sun is completely escaped the grasp of the night. So at this point, it's born. So the night is like the mother. It's like the womb where the sun is gestating. It's also like the afterlife. Then the sun reincarnates, and it goes through a period of gestation where it develops and grows till 12 noon. It's born. And then after its birth, it can continue to develop in the afternoon and have an influence on the earth. Then the sun begins to die, and it goes through a dying process that's gradual. And if you're a medical doctor or a biologist, you know that death is not instant. Death goes through stages. And then at midnight, the sun is finally dead. its influence on the world is largely gone, and then there's a period of the afterlife here, or a state of post-existence of the sun, and then it reincarnates and goes over and over again. And this is an ancient idea. The ancient Egyptians believed it, and apparently the Aztecs did too. And how do we know that? Well, by the symbology, and I'm going to go into this now. So where the caterpillar's legs come together, if you look at it the right way, here is the 13 reed, the new era that's being born or being formed. There's an arrow, there are a set of arrows indicating movement up, and then the legs of the caterpillar look very similar to the legs of a woman who is in the process of giving birth. So what they seem to be showing here is that the new era is being born from the past, and it's literally a birth. Here, the God King has a flint tongue that's pointing down. This is the end of the 252-year period. So what they're showing here is the death axis. They're showing us that here the sun has died, the previous eras of time have died, and that's why the flint tongue is here. And this is important because you could not have the birth of the new Aztec era without the death of the previous eras. So there has to be death in order for there to be life. The new era was born after the death of the previous eras. So this makes a lot of sense. And just moving on here to the next slide. This is kind of a summary slide. So in summary, the Aztec sunstone shows that the current era, or fifth sun, was born from the perfect alignment of the sun with cosmic time, reflected by the Venus cycles, the moon cycles, and even the life cycle of a caterpillar. It shows that Montezuma II was the earthly embodiment of the gods, not just one god, but at least two, and that his reign was supported by the gods and by the cosmos because he's emerging from the previous eras of Aztec history, and his name is associated with the gods. It also shows that the Aztec Empire of the fifth sun is the true successor to all the previous eras of Aztec history, and that it emerged from them. It was born from them at the ending or the death of their 2 centuries, at the end of the 252-year periods. Now, a couple of extra notes for those who are interested in the occult and esoteric things. There is clearly a Star of Ishtar pattern in the sunstone. And this makes sense because the Star of Ishtar is associated with an interest in the planet Venus in the Near East. And if the Aztecs were interested in Venus, this should show up in the sunstone, since they are recording the cycles of Venus. Now, whether they were aware of this or not is debatable, but the pattern is there. Also, the Enneagram is there very clearly. Now, I don't know if they were aware of this or not, but according to the famous mystic, occultist, George Gurdjieff, he said each cosmos as a whole contains an Enneagram. This was their representation of the cosmos, and very interestingly, it has an Enneagram in it. So, maybe Gurdjieff was on to something here about the Enneagram. So that's kind of cool. All right, well, I hope you found this video to be interesting. All of this is in my book, The Esoteric Sun, Unlocking the Secrets of Alchemy, Magic, and Sacred Symbols. In this book, I explain where religious symbols come from, where various traditions come from, where a lot of stuff from Masonry comes from, Christianity, Islam, the Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. Also, alchemy, a lot of it is solar. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please check out this book. It's available on Amazon.com. Please hit the like button if you like this video. Also, post questions or comments in the discussion section. I love questions and comments. I'll gladly answer them. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.